Hi, welcome back for another tutorial on Alteryx. One of my last tutorials, we briefly looked at the Generate Rows widget, and I apologized because it is a bit complex to understand what Generate Rows is doing, and the context that we used in that tutorial probably didn't clear it up completely. And so I wanted to follow that up with a tutorial that hopefully will more than not simplify the understanding you have of the Generate Rows widget. And to that light, my buddy John Q was generating a report, a very simple report actually, and he wanted to have a count of puppy registrations for the first quarter of this year. And when he generated that data set, he realized that there were days when no puppies were registered. And so that data was strictly off the report, and there wasn't a gap, there wasn't a zero, there was just simply a flat line report that showed the registrations without showing the days that we didn't register any puppies. And that is a concern of his, and he wanted to make sure that when he generates this kind of report, that even days where we didn't register show up on the report so we can see those and try to adjust for it. And I said, I can certainly help you fix that. And by the way, this is a very simple use case for the Generate Rows widget, which he was having a little trouble using as well. So let's take a look at the data that John Q was working with. If you're familiar from some of my previous tutorials, this is the ongoing creation of a data mart for puppies. And down here we have the puppy trick registration fact table. A couple things to note in here. It has the IDs for the puppy, the trick, the kennel, and the breed. He's not concerned with any of those. He's concerned with this registration date, and as well as the counting of these puppies. So starting with that data set, we're going to go ahead and build our workflow. For those of you that have been interested in MySQL, I have said that going forward, we would start to go ahead and use some of my database storage rather than Alteryx storage, especially when it comes to querying, because the queries are not all that tough to do as far as time consumption is concerned, but the outputs do take a bit, and I end up having to stop the tutorial just so you don't sit there for a minute and a half or 2 minutes waiting for 4,000 or 5,000 records to be written. So let's start out with this workflow. We want to bring in our MySQL data for the puppy registration. So in favorites we have our input data. We'll drag that in, make it a little bit bigger for you to see. Choosing my drop down, I have saved my Amazon RDS MySQL database connection, so I can just click on it. I always tend to start here in the SQL editor. We want to use the Daisy Hill puppy trick registration fact table. Once I type in that name, we hit the test query. It worked. Click OK. Want to see what the data looks like? We can refresh here. You'll notice one thing that I added that's not in the data model. Data models are just a general description, sometimes at a logical level. And as I was building that table, I realized that not only did we need the registration date, but we also wanted a fact count. So this is what's considered a factless fact table. There's real no facts in here. To make sure that you can sum and count things up properly, I found it a good idea to put in a record called fact count, a column called fact count for every record, and put a 1 in there. That lets you do some simple counting and algebra without having to create that field or to deal with nulls. So this is what John Q started with. He very simply added a select onto here. All he was worried about here in options, we're going to go select, deselect all. And we're just worried about the registration date, and we'll deal with that fact count so that we can count things up as we go forward. Without even running this, we can go ahead and drop a summarize on here. We want to group by registration date, and because we have this fact count, we can go ahead and do a sum of that, and you'll see later how this makes a much better solution than counting it. So we'll sum that. Go ahead and put a browse on the end of it. Run this very quickly. Pops into MySQL, brings the data out very quickly. 2,000 records. And here's a summarization. If you look through this data, which is possibly hard to see down here, you'll see that there is a missing date here on the 11th. So anywhere that there's a missing date for these counts or the summarizations, you will not get a record put into your graph, and your graph won't show that 0 in there. So we want to correct that. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and disconnect this and do some work. This will give us an error when we execute it, but we'll use it later and put it over here. So this is where our count records comes into play. So what I want to do is start out and make sure that I have all of the dates accounted for, and then I want to join this data to those dates so that the left join or right join of that will show me the records that had no puppy registrations, and I can still include that in my results set. So to start this, I need to find out all the days between. Now if you have a very robust data warehouse, you might have a date dimension, and that's a good place to find something like this. It is also very easy to do it if you don't want to go finding that or figuring out how to manage the data coming in. Generate rows is very easy to do, as well as this example is very simple. So what I want to do is create a record that has a row for every day, starting with the 1st of January and ending with the 31st of March. And I want to call this registration date. So in my Generate Rows, I'm going to create a new field called registration date. And it's going to be a date. And now I'm ready to begin. So the very first value in my date range is going to be January 1st. I will go ahead and create that simply by using a string in the default date format. I'll use single quotes. I tend to. Double quotes work as well. So the very first record in this set will be the 21st to 2021, January 1st. And I want to go ahead and stop counting when I get to the end of the first quarter. So I just put the date in here. And keep in mind, what is it that I'll be measuring? Well, it's not the row count, but it's the registration date. So clicking the ellipse over here brings me up to my editor. I can highlight the row count, my new field. And so now this will continue to loop, starting with the January 1st and ending with the March 31st. How do I loop through this? How do I go from my first record to my second record and subsequently to all the other ones? Well, I want to go ahead and increment the value one day at a time. Showing you how to actually build this. Again, the functions is not as usable as a formula, but since I know where it is, and also shows up at the top, date time is date time add, one of the great functions that's in Alteryx. So what I want to do is take the current value that will be for the registration date. So I go into variables here, new field, double click on registration date. And what I want to do is edit this to say I want to add 1 day to each one. So what this says in summary is that, and speaking of in summary, we will go ahead and just go drop a browse onto the end of this so we can see it a little bit better. So what this tells me is that we will start with January 1st, 2021. We'll increment this by 1 day at a time, creating a record for each increment, and we will stop once we surpass this registration final date. Or basically, we will continue as long as that date is less than or equal to the 31st. Run this very quickly. We'll ignore the error over here. Take a look at our browse, choose registration date for our browse, and we see that the min value is 0101 and the max value is 331, and that gives us a total number of values of 90, which are all unique. So this gives us every day in the first quarter. So I've created that range of records. Now it becomes very easy to go ahead and join these two record sets together. Grabbing my join. Left side of the join is going to be my data set. The right side of the join is going to be my date ranges. Click run very quickly. Oh, always forget. Assume it knows what I want to do. Obviously it doesn't know. We want to go ahead and click on registration date and registration date. Nice if I would actually spell this right. Let's go back and correct that spelling very quickly. Registration date, much better spelling. Bad news, I got to fix all these as well. Nice to have completion. Pretty easy to do. We'll just simply drag registration date into here with the proper spelling. Click OK. Do the same correction down here. Alteryx is pretty easy to correct things. Things should look much better coming into this now. We can see it matches the two up. Again, since I am missing dates on the right, I want to go ahead and keep the right side of this registration date and not the left. Call that registration date. Go ahead and move it up. Run this now. Lots of reminders along this workflow. I ran into these same problems when I ran this originally. One would think I would have learned. Coming out of MySQL, the default data type, even though I put a date going into MySQL, it went ahead and stores that as a date time so that when it comes back out, it comes back out as a date time field, not the date field that I need. Got to remember to change that. Actually, it's pretty good to show you that error. Much better. So now we look in the join in the middle. We have registration date and our fact count of 1 for each of the puppies that was registered. On the left, we have all the dates that are outside of the first quarter, so I don't have all these other puppies to count. It's a great way. I didn't have to do the filter to filter the data that I needed. I let my join do the filtering for me, and therefore you just simply rejected all these records without me having to create the filter. Could have created a filter if I wanted to, but I let the join do it for me. On the right hand side, we see that these are the days that we didn't actually have a puppy registered, and so they will be included in this set. We need to bring these back together since we want the join or the middle stream and we want the right or the bottom stream. That is our data set. Drag our union into this very quickly. Run this through and see what it looks like. Having fun today. Must be because it's Wednesday, hump day. So I've got to bring my right into my union as well. Left that out. If you caught that, great job for you. So happens when you build these live. So now we come back into it through the browse. We have our 90 records. You can see that for the 11th, and there's missing dates, I do not have a 0, I have a null. So I want to get a 0 in there. Makes a pretty simple thing to do for this process. Drag this over. We want to go ahead and so two things we can do. I am a big believer in using formulas. I'll drop a formula in here. A lot of people like to use a data cleansing. Data cleansing would correct this as well. Data cleansing has some specific data manipulations that you can use. If what you're trying to do matches one of these, it goes ahead and does the job. If anything more sophisticated, it can't do it. I also tend to avoid data cleansing because Alteryx has what's basically considered a one record at a time workflow, which means as long as a record can flow forward, it gets processed. So every record that comes through here will go ahead and get itself put through the formula one at a time as they appear. I have seen that data cleansing holds it for bulk record sets or to a complete record set is available. I'm not sure why. It may be a data cleansing is a macro. But when you have a very large data set, especially coming out of a database, doing some joins, etc., you don't necessarily want those records to stack up in the data cleansing. It's nice for them to flow through individually. Data sets that I'm using today are, in most of my classes or lessons, are very small, and so one or the other works. But again, I tend to like formulas. We'll go ahead and get rid of this guy because we're going to do it with the formula. We're going to update the fact count, and we need to set it to a null. We've been lobbying Alteryx to go ahead and give us a function for doing this. They have not yet released one, and it's basically, we could create our own macro if we really wanted to go that trouble, but that's subject of another class. We want to use the if conditional function or the if then else. I like the IIF or the if function. So if our fact count is null, and I'm sort of building this backwards. Make this a little bit bigger for you. Let's build this in the straight way. That's okay. We'll go ahead and get rid of all this. IIF. If it is null, I need to use the isNull function. Give it the variable. Registration date, not registration date. If the fact count is null, I want to give it a value of 0. Otherwise, we want to keep fact count. Finishing that up gives us the data preview of a 1, which is the very first record. Now when we run this through, take a look at the data coming out. You can see that for the 11th, we now have a 0. So when we graph this, it'll go ahead and account for that. So we're going to go ahead and round this out, dropping in a quick report because I just want to make sure it worked out well for John Q. We're going to use the interactive chart. Before we can configure it, we have to feed it with some data. We know the data looks good, so we'll go ahead and run it into there. Configure the chart. Pretty simple. Get used to doing this. Add a layer. Call this trick registration. Let's go ahead and make this a bar chart. Across the x-axis, we want to go with the registration date. Going up the y, we'll do the sum of fact count. And you can see that we have gaps in here for those days where it's not. In case that's not quite as easy to see as you would like it to be. Gaps are very obvious to me. We can go ahead and make this a line chart. And you can see all these dropping down to 0, the days that we didn't actually have registrations. Put this back to a bar chart. Close it. Run it. We can look in the browse, click on a report, and we can see the report appearing there as well. We can see the gaps. All the days are accounted for. John Q will be very happy with this data set, and I will either turn this workflow over to him to finish it out the way he needs to, or I'll store this data into our data mart so that he can have it as a reporting table, and then he can run this on a regular basis. I know John Q's next question is going to be, can I turn this into an interactive workflow so that I can tell you which quarter I want and you can just generate the report? And the answer is I certainly can. But John, it sounds like something you need to do. If you need some help, give me a holler. Hopefully at this presentation will let him and you understand generate rows a little bit better. It's a looping structure. something to get used to. It solves a lot of problems that you might have in reports or within SQL that are pretty difficult to do, but it works out pretty easily in Alteryx. Don't forget to go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Drop me any comments if you have any questions or ideas for future workflows, and I'll be more than happy to create a little presentation and example for you.